Thanks for staying with us here on The Real Story. It may be a short legislative session already racing by, but Governor Lamont has been very clear, telling lawmakers there wasn't enough done for the climate last session, and it must be a priority this go around. And that's where this massive climate bill touching on a little bit of everything comes in. Joining me now is Democratic Senator Christine Palm, Vice Chair of the Environment Committee. Thank you so much for being here with us.
My pleasure.
As we said, this is a huge bill, and there wasn't a lot done for the climate last year. A lot obviously falls to the Environment Committee, though. But before we talk about some of those mitigation efforts, let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now in the state. What climate challenges and environmental symptoms are we already seeing as impacts here in Connecticut?
I think it's clear to anybody paying attention to air quality or air temperature that we are under siege with terribly chaotic weather patterns. From the deep freeze last May, which devastated our local farmers, to the floods in the Norwich area, which displaced 500 families, to the fact that kids can't play outside all summer because there's gray smoke in the air. We are experiencing a calamity of climate chaos. And I know there is pushback on that. There are some folks who doubt that. But we only have to look at the scientists who confirm this over and over again. And it's really time to do something here in Connecticut and nationwide.
You mentioned farmers. You know, you've been talking to a lot of residents, throughout the session and for a while here, and with many different impacted lifestyles and businesses. When it comes to farmers, we have Agricultural Day coming up soon at the Capitol, and that industry, as you said, has really struggled a lot this past year, losing money from droughts and flooding and early freezes, all in the same year. A lot of farmers say they need money to afford climate resilience tools and to help fight and recover from all of this. Tell me about what you're hearing about farmers' reality right now.
Well, farmers are actually business people, right? So we in Connecticut have a nostalgic attitude about farmers, but the reality is they fight against the same vagaries of the economy that any business does. Right. And the unpredictability of the weather has wreaked havoc on their bottom line. So that's one area of industry that has been affected. In the last 14 years in Connecticut, there have been 12 federally recognized, FEMA-recognized disasters. And it is predicted that in the next 56 years, we're going to lose about 400 acres of land in Connecticut to flooding. So whether that means a several $million-dollar mansion on the coast or low-lying fertile valley land, it's a devastation.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit now about this big climate omnibus bill that you have been a huge part of. There's a lot of conversation around this, definitely a lot of different interests here, and it has been quite controversial. So you've even celebrated the nickname that it was given, the Green Monster bill. You and your co-authors here really trying to bolster a bipartisan effort and have even tied yourself to some federal support. So before we get into some of the details, where does this bill stand right now in the legislature?
So right now, we had a public hearing recently on this bill, and as early as tomorrow, the Environment Committee will be voting to raise it out of committee, where it then goes forward to the full floor of the House, where it will be my privilege to take it out. Assuming it passes the House, it then goes on to the Senate, and then eventually to the governor's desk for signature. I'm very hopeful to get bipartisan support. I don't think it will be as popular as it is among Democrats. That's just simply a matter of voting record. But what we are doing differently in this bill is filling it with, as we keep saying, carrots rather than sticks. Yep. There are so much incentive for businesses, which, after all, is what the Republican Party always claims to care most about. So what we are doing with this bill is giving incentives to companies to replace fossil fuel generated infrastructure with that which is renewable and green. We're giving a 10% bump to municipalities that repair schools, failing and aging schools that need to be renovated or rebuilt with solar and heat pumps and that sort of stuff. We have incentives for B Corps, those that have social and environmental justice missions, to give them, to waive business fees and tax rebates. So it is chock-a-block full with incentives. And your question about the federal funds, the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, is full of climate, despite its sort of unfortunate name, has a great many resources for those states that are trying to convert away from fossil fuels.
Gotcha. So you mentioned this bill being all carrot, no stick. Last session, there were a lot of things that failed when it came to attempts at climate legislation. But, you also dropped the greenhouse gas reduction roadmap that you had championed at changing the approach to more incentive than punishment. Tell me a little bit about why that change was made in this bill to focus more on those incentives.
Well, this is what they call a speaker's bill, which is a priority of the caucus, and that pretty much guarantees it will pass. We do need to have it be a compromise with the other caucus. But the good news is that this is a very ambitious bill, but also realistic and achievable. Yeah. And so whether businesses are inspired to do the right thing because it's the right thing or because it will help their bottom line, I don't really care what their motivation is. We're offering this in this bill and hoping that they will lead with the sustainable practices. And there is a group called the Sustainable Business Council in Connecticut, which is very high on this bill. And even our friends at CBIA are very happy with much of this bill. So I think that's a really good sign that the business community will be on board.
You mentioned getting some bipartisan support and about how that focus on incentives is something Republicans wanted. Republican Senate Leader Harding has, said incentives are a better direction to get, Republican support. There is a lot of work still being put into this bill and things we, could see change. But as you mentioned, it's gone up for public comment. There's been a lot of discourse about this thus far. Is there anything you think is most misunderstood or misrepresented about this proposal?
I think the biggest stumbling block is going to be the difference between declaring a climate crisis and a climate emergency.
Okay.
Emergency, which is something we tried to get through last time, was controversial because that triggers executive authority in the governor that makes some folks nervous. Okay. We're declaring a climate crisis in this bill, which does not have the same legal authority, but it does send a strong message to our delegation in Washington that we are taking this seriously in Connecticut and therefore opening up the pathway for some federal funds.
Yep. And tell me a little bit more about that, kind of tie to federal support. You mentioned the money from Inflation Reduction Act there. How would this really work, and what would that message be to our federal delegation?
So this is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity because of the IRA to build out our infrastructure one time. In other words, with ARPA funding because of COVID, that funding ran out, and then there was a fiscal cliff, as we call it, at the Capitol, where programs were put in place, then the money dried up, so the program had to end. What we're trying to do differently with the IRA funds is that if you build a solar collector on a school rooftop, you don't have to build it again for decades. So it's not an ongoing expense. It's a one-time capital expense to shore up our infrastructure. And there's a lot in this bill for workforce training and retraining. So folks who do currently work in fossil fuel-based industries can get retrained for solar installation, heat pump, geothermal. Things like that.
Get them ready for green economy jobs.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think we owe it to our young people to arm them with tools to be part of the solution to a problem they had no hand in creating. I feel really strongly about allowing young folks, young entrepreneurs, there's a section in this bill, a pilot program for young entrepreneurs who want to develop alternatives to plastics, and the state will help them.
Right. Right. So there's been some concern about pricing out and regulating developers. This bill is asking new constructions and renovations in Connecticut to be electrified and phasing out phasing in, pollution-free HVAC and heating requirements. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have been worried about adding anything that might detract from increasing housing and affordable housing supply, because we know housing is always a big conversation and point of interest during these sessions. What's your response to that?
Well, I hate it when it comes down to all the good programs fighting for the crumbs.
Right.
There always seems to be money for programs when certain folks want it. It shouldn't come down to affordable housing or green sustainable practice, because we need both, just as we need children's mental health. Why should we pick that over this? It's all part and parcel of an enlightened society. Right. So because we are trying to integrate systems with using this money, this one-time money that we're going to get, we're taking advantage of that, candidly. There is bonding money available for certain projects. We wanted to tap into underused resources that we already have. Okay. State agencies that may be sitting on some money, we could use it, reapportion it differently.
Using money from different sources to, like you said, not picking one or the other, but trying to make all this happen at once. So, going a little bit bigger picture here, obviously there's a whole lot in this bill, 22 different sections. But in the time we have, what do you think are the biggest policies that you may have not mentioned yet included in here? And what have you been hearing the most testimony or feedback about?
Well, there were 188 people who testified in the hearing, which ended about midnight, and there were about 5 against this bill. So that's a really good sign. And I think the public, 80% of whom are known in virtually every poll to care about this, to recognize that it's real and to care about it, and to worry about their children. So what I'm hearing is that it's desperately needed. The devil is always in the details. My job is to make sure this bill passes, but that it doesn't get watered down so dramatically that it has no teeth left. We want it to be a really strong bill. We are mindful of an inadequate electric grid. We know that we can't convert overnight, so nobody is saying we can. But if we don't start now, when is that magic time that we will all be on the same page? Probably never. So my feeling is, as we talk about a bridge to a sustainable economy, we just have to be careful not to make that bridge so attractive and so strong that people get halfway across it and then they plunk down and say, this is the end unto itself. We have to get to the other side of the fossil fuel economy.
And last thing here with our last couple minutes, you mentioned more than 180 people signed up at the public hearing for this bill. It was a really, really big talker. But obviously there's lots of other stuff happening in the Environment Committee this session, not just the climate omnibus bill. For you as a lawmaker, how important is it for you to hear and read that public testimony from all sorts of different people here in Connecticut about the various bills?
It's terribly important, and I will say all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we are all in this for the same reason. I don't doubt at all that my Republican colleagues want what is best from their perspective. It's always a matter of how do we get there. Yep. So the other bills that we're working on in the Environment Committee have to do with neonicotinoids, various kinds of pesticides, rodenticides, which are terrible. They are the things that sort of half kill a mouse. The mouse crawls out of your house, gets eaten by a raptor, and then the raptor dies. Yeah. So there are any number of really good bills. We're trying to mitigate PFAS once again, to include firefighting equipment. There are many bills like that. They're all terribly worthy. This omnibus bill, which, by the way, the Green Monster came from the Yankee Institute as an attempted insult, but we just own it because it is a monstrously important bill. Yeah. So we're trying very hard to do something that's achievable, aspirational, but the time is now to do it, and it has to be bold. Yeah. Or what's the point?
Well, that's unfortunately all the time we have, but thank you so much. Lots of really important things moving through the Environment Committee. We'll be sure to keep up with that and see what gets voted out, but thank you again for being here.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course, that does it for us here on The Real Story, but if you want to watch these segments again, you can head to fox61.com or download the free Fox 61 News app and watch The Real Story every Sunday at 10 a.m. right here on Fox 61 or streaming on Fox 61 Plus. Have a great morning.